seekers. Today I have another special treat for the audience. I've brought a special guest who's been on the show before, my old professor and mentor, Paul Bali. Welcome back to the show, Paul.
Thanks, Dale.
Excellent. And the last time we had you on, we were speaking about communications from higher powers, and how does one identify that, or what are the quote unquote higher powers that might be there, and that sort of thing. Now we have a different topic for today, but just before I get into that, one major criticism I was getting as a host on that show is I usually sort of let my guests introduce themselves, so it allows the audience to kind of ground, like where is the guest coming from, and I forgot to do that with you the last time. So
is that right?
Yeah. I just assume people knew you from the Ask an Atheist Anything podcast that we did prior. So
yeah.
But yeah, we do have new people in the audience that may not know who you are. So maybe just introduce us as to who you are. Give us a bit about your quote unquote faith journey. Like what do you believe? Where are you coming from on that front there?
Oh yeah. Well, I think the audience will get a sense maybe of my faith journey as we get into this topic. I think it'll be hard for me to separate my own personal experience and perspective from this scholarly topic. But I'm your old prof. That's the biographical fact number one, right? Dale, you took your first course with me. Would it have been 2 summers ago now? I don't have a good sense of the time. It feels like it was about a couple years ago now, maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago.
Yeah, it was summer 2019.
Okay. Oh, that recent, eh? Just 1 year ago?
Yeah.
Wow. Really? Oh, well, it feels like I've known you longer than that. Well, lots happened in a year. I've been a contract teacher at Ryerson University here in Toronto for quite a while now, 15 years or so. And in the academic world, I'm in philosophy, but I've always found a way to do sort of philosophical theology in these philosophy departments where religion, even a very analytic sort, is often a minority pursuit. But going all the way back to my graduate work, I found a way to focus on sort of the experiential side of religion and the social psychological side of it. Not that I don't enjoy a good analytic throwdown, but and of course we all want to, in some sense, be analytic. We all want to be clear and infer correctly. But I like to get sometimes into the messy, inescapably vague stuff we were talking about before you hit record, right? As you said, reality's messy. So sometimes you got to track that with messy language. I think today it will get a little bit messy. But hopefully we can make some sense of this interesting topic you've chosen. That's about it. What about? Does the audience know about your big move coming up?
The SNS audience would know about it, but I'm Paul's referring to the fact that I was accepted to the Masters of Philosophy program, and I'll be starting that up this fall. So yeah, I'm really excited about that, to stretch my wings, so to speak, and see what I can do in an actual academic setting, as opposed to just on podcasts or in my private time.
You'll do great. You'll thrive there. So they're lucky to have you.
Hopefully things won't get too messy, but a little bit of mess is good.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, Paul sort of hinted. So what is the topic that we're going to be speaking about today? And I wanted to pick something that Paul hasn't spoken on before, but I know from taking his class, he has a lot of interesting things to say. And that's, okay, the phenomenon of religion. How do we explain that? What are some of the explanations for this quote unquote religious phenomenon that we have, and why people believe in religions and that sort of thing? So I think on that front, the first thing to do is to turn it straight away to you and give some kind of definitions. Okay, well, in the first place, if we're trying to explain religion, what do we mean by religion? What is it? And
And the mess begins. Yeah, that's usually when I teach a Phil religion type course, it is a question you got to raise probably on day one. What are we talking about here? The word religion is in the title of the course usually, and you've got to define the course and its mandate. I tend to answer it with evasion and negation and promissory note that it will be answered along the way, or we'll start to delineate an answer as we get through the course, and maybe I'll do the same for today's conversation. Let's say, it's one of those things you're tempted to say, well, we kind of all know roughly what we're talking about when we say religion. Of course, as soon as you propose a particular definition, you will always find exceptions to it. I think it's a intrinsically vague concept, and you can't put firm boundaries around it. So there will always be borderline cases. I think relevant to some of what we'll be getting into today, if you think about religion as our orientation towards something transcendent, something beyond us, something sort of next level, that because of the vast gap between us and that thing we're in a relationship with, we'll need a special language for it. We'll need special rituals for it. We'll need a special way of approaching it and depicting it. And this transcendent thing, which means it's beyond us, it's next level, is usually, though not always, it's usually connected to the origin of our world itself. So you can think of the creator God, and in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, that's a very, very direct, very literal kind of understanding of the transcendent, or God being the origin or creator of our world. But some version of that relationship, that when we connect to this transcendent thing, we're not connecting to something that just happens to be on the next level. We're connecting to something which also is somehow what generates our level. If you think of the simulation host metaphor, if you're in the simulation and you try to enter into some kind of relationship, not just with the cohabitants of your simulation, but you try to reach out to the host or the creator or the programmer of the simulation itself, that would be analogous to what we're doing in religion, right, as creatures on Earth. And of course, the simulator, the programmer, the host is also the creator of your world. So that the simulator, this is a metaphor we're talking about, right, for the creaturely divine relationship. Religion would be, it's a bit of a catch-all term for all the ways we negotiate that divide. It's a cultural phenomenon. It's very personal too, but on the cultural scale, you could say religion is the cultural organization of that relationship, of that orientation between creature and creator, or between these two levels. Of course, the question today is whether there really is a second level, right? So, but the definition I'm kind of offering here doesn't presuppose the second level is real. It's like you could have a relationship with ghosts, even if ghosts aren't real. The relationship would be your orientation towards this thing you take to be real and how it affects your life, and the way you might organize your life around this belief. And same with religion. There's no debate that religion is real. Religion is true in that sense. It's an undisputable fact. The question is whether religion is referring to anything real on its own terms. And that's today's question.
Interesting. Okay, so yeah, I think you would definitely, to summarize your views, there are certain things that clearly belong in the quote unquote religion category, but it's important to recognize that there isn't this clear boundary. There's kind of a diffuseness, where there might be some gray zones in that. You can't categorize everything, but there are definitely some clear things in your view that yes, this is in the religious category.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I did have a follow up here. I wanted to just sort of give my understanding, and it's sort of similar to what you were saying with the transcendence and that sort of thing. But I sort of look as a quote unquote religion is they're a set of authoritative teachings relating to the nature of ultimate reality, whether that's God or whatever, as well as relating specifically to the ultimate purpose of human beings within creation or within this reality, whatever it is. So that's sort of those two elements are sort of how I look at defining religion and distinguishing it from things like Marxism or Confucianism. I would say that's not a religion. I think you sort of hinted at the first aspect. What do you make of the second aspect, relating to the ultimate purpose for human beings and how to achieve that? That would fit in the religious category.
Yeah, that seems to be in the right neighborhood. I don't think I would take issue with that. We're talking about ultimate things, typically in religion. If religion is connecting us to this source of our existence, then it would seem to be the most important thing to get right about. That relationship will be the most important relationship, and that our fulfillment as creatures will depend on getting that relationship right. That does seem right. Right away, all these possible exceptions, start flooding my head. I was thinking about the earlier part of your definition too, that it concerns specifically a set of teachings. On the one hand, I wouldn't really take issue with that, but this term teachings is a little bit vague, and maybe that's good. Maybe it should be a little bit vague. I would just point out to you that when you define religion as a set of teachings of some kind, I do think you're showing your colors as a scholar there. That is, you are a person living the life of the mind, and for you, the teachings, the propositions, the beliefs are so central to religious life, and having the correct propositions about this ultimate reality is so central to your mission as a kind of jnana yogi, I would say, that you're defining religion itself as a set of teachings. I would, and I probably would have done the same maybe 15 or 20 years ago. I'm not saying I've improved on you. I just, my sense is now just, well, that's a pretty scholarly take on religion, right? To reduce it to a set of propositions or doctrines. And there's so much more. I don't think the beliefs are quite as central for everybody. Not that they'll ever be irrelevant. Humans have minds, and any proper religion will have something to do with getting the mind correctly oriented to that reality, that ultimate reality. But there are other ways of correctly orienting yourself with that reality than having the correct propositions, right? So you could talk about the correct form of behavior. There might be people who are just acting with the right, they're just moving in the right way now because they're in harmony with that ultimate reality. They move with grace. We use terms like that, and that could be at least as important as having the correct beliefs. So there might be very graceful people who have a kind of harmonious, graceful relationship with that ultimate reality. But if you ask them for a clear statement of propositions about the nature of this ultimate reality and our relationship with it, they might get a little bit tongue-tied. And maybe they haven't even thought very clearly about it in the way that you have. And I would hesitate to say that they're not yet religious because they haven't engaged, with that belief side. Anyway, that's just a bit of a
That's
quibble, but of course we could quibble all day about the definitional,
I'm glad
part.
that. So yeah, I think that I'm glad that you brought that up because you're absolutely right, and that was something I just kind of it kind of betrays. Yeah, I've got my bias in terms of that, but yeah, religion is doings and practices and that sort of
Mhm.
thing. So yeah, I think you're right. I would need to work on modifying my definition there. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That was great.
Oh
Uh,
no. Well, action is a nice broad category, right? So you might say religion is about acting in accordance with that ultimate reality. And then, of course, belief is a kind of action, right? Believing is a kind of doing. Though it's a very abstract mental doing, but you're doing something when you believe correctly and when you get your beliefs in line with the ultimate reality. So, yeah, maybe some kind of action is the preferable, broader category for the definition at the outset.
Gotcha. Perfect. Okay. And just very quickly, this may seem like a stupid question to some in the audience, but okay. So what do you mean by an explanation? What
Oh God,
exactly?
yeah. Yeah, that's hmm. I don't know. How would you define it?
Well, so I was thinking. So number one, you could look at it. Okay, well, what is the origins of the religion historically? How did the phenomenon of religious or religions get started in the first place? Or we could have a wider look, like explaining all religious phenomena, past, present, and future, in terms of its development. So
Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, I get you. I thought you were asking for some broad, um, almost metaphilosophical definition of explanation.
oh no,
I got
no.
a bit tongue-tied. Okay, so you're asking the more specific question of what is it we're trying to explain today when we talk about explaining religion? I mean, yeah, I haven't thought really carefully before about this distinction you make between explaining the historical origins of religion, which assumedly go back, I don't know, thousands, tens of thousands of years in human history, but um, and explaining all of its subsequent manifestations. I guess the dream would be that if you explain the origins right, you probably captured most of its subsequent manifestations. That, in other words, we haven't changed that much.
Yeah.
And I think yeah. Yeah, we'll see today as we get into specific examples. Some of them do seem to be focused on the historical origins and um, seem to imply that once you've got that, you've pretty much understood the phenomenon. But yeah.
Cool. All right. All right. Well, yeah, I think at this point, let's stop beating around the bush. Let's get into what are some of these explanations. And when you taught us in class, you sort of broke it up into two major categories. There's first of all the traditional religious or supernatural type explanation versus the naturalistic or natural explanations. So yeah, I'll turn it to you. Do you want to maybe just sort of, in a general terms, explain the difference between those two types and focus in on specifically the religious or supernatural type explanation? What is that explanation? What does it typically entail in your view?
Yeah. Well, religion exists. Religion has happened, and no one is debating that. The question is, how did it happen, and what is it? What explains it? And yeah, it seems pretty useful to distinguish broadly between these two general answers. On the one hand, you've got this religious explanation of religion. That's the explanation of Christianity that a Christian would tend to recognize and accept, or the explanation of Islam that a Muslim would tend to accept, which is that religion is the result of contact between humanity and the divine, right? And it's messy, maybe, and you might say, well, not all religion is the result of a clear contact between humanity and the divine. Some of it's false religion, some of it's trickle down revelation, etc., etc. But the general answer is religion enters our world as this cultural phenomenon because humanity at some point has made revelatory contact with the divine. So when man meets God, religion happens. That's the religious answer, classic religious answer. And then the non-religious answer, sometimes they're called naturalistic explanations of religion. These are attempts to explain everything that happens on the ground in religion, in social psychological reality, without referring to or assuming any kind of supernatural or transcendent being, right? So the game or the challenge in the naturalistic explanation of religion is to explain religion, maybe in its historical origins, how it happened. It's quite a phenomenon. It's something very interesting that's happened to this particular creature on Earth. And see if you can explain that, staying completely within the natural world. Now, chances are you're not going to be explaining religion using Newtonian physics. Usually it's going up a couple levels. Actually, most of these naturalistic explanations of religion operate at the social and psychological level, right? The social sciences. So they try to reduce religious behavior and phenomena to natural social psychological phenomena. But increasingly after Darwin, we see some attempts to not completely reduce religion, but explain many religious phenomena using Darwinian principles. So that's the distinction. Was that pretty clear?
Okay, so at this point, before we're going to look in some of these various types of explanations in more detail, but I first want to focus on the traditional religious or supernatural type explanation. So, in your view, are there different types of explanations even within the religious category? So, I know that you kind of, I'll put that to you because things that apply to Christianity may be different to religious explanations of Hinduism, for example. So, what are your thoughts there?
I would suspect that the differences between the Christian account of the origins of Christianity and the Hindu account of the origins of Hinduism might not be that great. The differences wouldn't be that great. I suspect, though, and I'm just, it's based on very scanty knowledge of, if I may generalize,
Sure.
certainly overgeneralize, tribal scale religion, which is probably for the most of our history, religion was a tribal scale phenomenon. We lived at the tribal scale in bands of a few dozen people, maybe, many of them related to us biologically, and I'm guessing there are some commonalities across the different tribal religions, partly just because of that scale. But I suspect there might be some profound differences. I mean, the whole notion of the supernatural and the transcendent, I just wonder how recent these categories are. It seems to me that the very idea of the supernatural is one that becomes especially marked as a culture attains a very distinct sense of the natural. The natural as this orderly system of principles guiding the behavior of natural phenomena. Once you've got a very vivid sense of that and you start to delineate some of the particular deep laws, then you've got, at least conceptually, this possible counter note to it, which is the idea of the supernatural, something beyond that entire system. I don't know if that duality operates so strongly in a lot of the tribal religions. Whereas, as I said, the difference between the Christian and the Hindu account of religion might not actually be that different, as different as they can seem when we're really zoomed in on civilizational religion. They both would I think say that their religion is the result of an encounter between humans and the supernatural, the divine. And the divine is certainly something which has purchase outside of the natural world. And it comes to us through what we call revelation, and often through filtered through special humans, whether prophets or sages or rishis, who've heard the sacred word and then brought it down from the mountains and spread it to their civilization. There will certainly be differences when you go from religion to religion. When you ask them for their particular account of how it all happened. But something like some modification of our original definition, I think would still apply, right? They're going to talk about religion being a set of practices that are their response to this contact they've made between the human and something quite other.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, my understanding. So, one follow-up question for you, because I'm a little confused on something you said. So, in terms of the Christian and versus Hindu or Buddhist, the specifics don't matter. I think that would sort of fit into your original definition, in that in one form or another, maybe we differ on the specifics form, but in one way or another, humans gain access to a transcendent realm and gain knowledge about that transcendent realm. You mentioned that might be different for like Aboriginal religions or animistic religions. Did I understand you correctly? Like, you think sort of the supernatural explanations of their religion are intertwined with the natural world, like they don't have a concept of the transcendent in a way? Or
I again, my knowledge is so scanty, but it might be that. You ever hear this theory of Karl Jaspers, the Axial Age and Axial Age religion? Karl Jaspers, I guess he was was he a Swiss or German theologian, psychologist, and he talked about the Axial Age, which would have been about 2,500 years ago, where we get these great figures like Siddhartha Gautama in North India and Socrates in Greece, and this shift to a very kind of self-conscious form of humanity. And then I think of the Julian Jaynes view of the shift from bicameral to regular religion. Not that we need to go through a summary of that for this show, but Julian Jaynes, this American psychologist, had a view that religion about 3,000 years ago and older was quite different from what it is today. And in his view, the whole idea, that we are in some kind of fallen state and separate from the transcendent or the creator. Actually, calling it the transcendent is reflective of that feeling that we are fallen from it and separated from it. That whole idea, which we tend to associate with religion itself, that might be, a recent, so to speak, development. Now, if you go back far enough, and maybe this will take us back into some examples of the tribal scale of religion, there's not this marked sense that we've been separated from this reality, and religion isn't hyper focused and obsessed with getting us back to that state of unity or harmony with our Creator. That there's a sense that all of life is suffused with that relationship. And religion in that tribal scale then might be conservative, in the sense that its aim is not to radically disrupt your form of life and have you break with house and home and have war within families to follow Jesus. It's conservative in the sense of just maintaining a relationship which is already existent and already good and which suffuses all of your life. So the idea of, I'm not sure how to divide neatly between the tribal and the civilizational, but it does seem sensible there will be some important distinctions there, and this might be one of them, right? That in civilization we're quite alienated from the divine, most of us, and religion is the set of techniques to get us back into a relationship with it, and it wasn't necessarily always like that. In that case, the transcendent might be a particularly civilizational way of talking about this thing.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's interesting. So, yeah, believe it or not, one of the questions that you requested is Julian Jaynes' bicameral hypothesis.
Oh yeah, we are going to talk about that. That's right. That's a great classic example of an attempt to explain the origins of. Actually, he was trying to explain the origins of self-awareness or something like that, but ended up with this happy byproduct of a total explanation of religion in his view, I think.
Yeah, so, yeah, I'll actually turn it to you. We can get into that right away. Actually, I'll give it to you to sort of explain what that is. Also this notion of like a former time when things were better, this ideal state. It kind of reminds me as a Christian of like, oh, thinking back to Adam and Eve and the pre the fall in the Garden of Eden and that sort of thing. But yeah, before we get into that, what is, okay? Maybe explain some details. What is this bicameral hypothesis that Julian Jaynes is, and how does it explain the religious phenomenon, that sort of thing?
Yeah. So Julian Jaynes had this view that around 3,000 years ago, there was a profound shift in human mental life. And the basic story is that 3,000 years ago and older, we weren't self-aware in the way we take for granted now. I mean, now we all have this kind of Hamlet-like internal voice that accompanies us through life. Sometimes we call it the voice of conscience when it's guiding us on the moral path. But it's often just this kind of, I think Don DeLillo called it in Underworld, the dusty hum of who we are. It's this kind of inner voice, which is usually our own. It sounds a little bit like our own voice that other people hear in social communication. But it's our own little internal secret friend, and it talks, literally speaks language to us and guides us. Often, and Jaynes takes this to be quite an important piece of data, notice that this voice in your head often becomes louder or more insistent when you're in stressful situations. And for Jaynes, that's evidence that its original function was to guide us through stressful decision-making nodes in the journey of life. So his view is that 3,000 years, call it the bicameral age. Bicameral just means two chambers. And in his view, our mind was sort of schizophrenic 3,000 years ago and older, this in the bicameral age. And we didn't have this intimate voice that spoke to us in our own voice. Rather, what we had were these sort of schizophrenic audio hallucinations, which were taken to be the voices of gods or departed, respected ancestors or great heroes or kings. And they would act as sort of the voice of conscience or the voice of stress resolution. And, Jaynes, part of what's interesting about Jaynes's account is the evidence, maybe selectively gathered, I can't say, but he points to a lot of phenomena that we're kind of familiar with from cultural history, and then asks us to see it in the new light of his theories. So the fact that in the Iliad, the ancient Greek epic, the account of the Trojan War, he points out that the characters in the Iliad, this huge epic poem, they never sit down and think about what to do. that whenever they reach a stressful decision point, they hallucinate. Jaynes, he was a psychologist whose specialty was schizophrenia, which really got him thinking about this. And I mean, I guess a really provocative way maybe of stating his view is that 3,000 years ago and older, our entire species was schizophrenic. We heard voices, but it wasn't pathological. It wasn't dysfunctional. When you've got a whole culture which is organized religiously around the reception of these voices and their identification and categorization, and you're taught to respect them. And in fact, when you live in a relatively stable culture, these voices can offer wise advice. The voices in Jaynes's view are nothing more than the subconscious codification of your culture's own principles of wise action, right? And today that voice comes out to us in our own voice, but in the bicameral era, it would come out as the voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi or whatever, just hovering around your head when you're deciding whether to fight Darth Vader or not. And So I mean that's the Jane's bicameral hypothesis, and I guess he started out in his own account just to explain how weird the ancient world was, how weird ancient psychology seemed to be from the evidence given to us in works like the Iliad. But he ended up as a kind of byproduct of this bicameral theory with an account of the origins of religion as we know it. I guess religion in the bicameral era would have been just the cultural organization of these schizophrenic hallucinations. So the gods would be the sort of fixed images of the sources of these voices we'd receive daily. And then religion after the bicameral era would be our attempt to return, sort of with nostalgic anguish, our attempt to return to that Edenic life when the gods walked with us and spoke to us quite intimately, right? So post-bicameral religion, which is what we're in now, and even what we identify as the very old religions like Judaism and Hinduism, these are largely post-bicameral phenomena, meaning they are attempts to get us back to that intimacy, to that spoken intimacy with these guides, with these gods.
It's interesting. I found this hypothesis interesting. So number one, in the first place, for atheists and skeptics that aren't familiar with this, so they actually see schizophrenia. The vast majority of human beings 3,000 years ago, and again, it doesn't have to be at that boundary. You could push it back if that's problematic historically or something like that. But he would say the majority of people are schizophrenic. And this was seen as sort of the ideal state, kind of like a Garden of Eden type state, where God's directly told you reach a certain stress threshold on a decision or something like that. God's voice literally tells you to do this. Okay, you just do it. And later, like in the biblical period with prophets and that sort of thing, that's kind of like a longing to, I want to have that same old relationship I had with God. And so you come up with various mechanisms, like the prophetic oracles or astrology or the various mechanisms that people would do, picking up, flipping a coin, stuff like that. But these are kind of like remnants left over. So yeah, obviously as a Christian, I don't believe this is true, but there are some interesting similarities there, and things to think about in terms of an explanation there. So
yeah, I think we'll I can understand why as a Christian you would see this view as being inconsistent with your view, but I think we'll find with a lot of these naturalistic explanations of religion, they don't function as sort of deductive proofs of atheism in any sense. And in fact, strictly speaking, most of them are quite consistent with our religious worldview. I think this is an important point to stress and clarify from the outset, that there's a way of telling the Julian Jaynes bicameral story which makes it consistent probably with Christian history, right? There's a way of doing, we'll talk about Feuerbachian projection theory in a moment, I'm sure. There's a way of telling that story and making it consistent with some version of theism. Now, that doesn't mean that Feuerbach or Julian Jaynes themselves were believers, and they probably saw their views as being somewhat destructive to traditional theological belief. But strictly speaking, you can believe in the reality of God, say, and also believe that these social psychological complexities are in play. It's analogous to, I'm sure a lot of your audience have thought through this, and I'm sure you've talked about it, how there's maybe a way of making Darwinian evolution quite consistent with some version of creationism, right? Where evolution becomes the on-the-ground mechanism through which God enacts his creative plan. Whether that's correct or not is a second question. But you can see in principle that's logically consistent, perhaps. And similarly here, right? It might be that there is a God and God has made contact with us, but in the initial contact there's confusion, or in the initial contact we do receive it in this sort of bicameral way, and then we start to internalize the voice of God, and the voice of God sort of incarnates into our own speech patterns. But I'm curious to hear more about why you think it's strictly inconsistent with the Christian account.
Yeah. So it would be. So I think you're absolutely right, and we actually just had Michael Behe on
Oh, right, yeah.
our show. He takes exactly he's a committed Roman Catholic. He takes exactly the same view in terms of, hey, I'm open to certain things in evolution. It's he debates the mechanisms of being capable without some sort of intelligent design input, being able to create biological diversity, but he's open to, we evolved from a common ancestor and that sort of thing. So
yeah,
there are ways. That's an important point that you raised, that things can be partial explanations and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I think when it comes to specific explanations, it would more be at the level of, okay, well, divine revelation and how you read history that's supposedly revealed, and it would depend on what your specific religion teach and that sort of thing. But I would say I think that biblical history would kind of contradict the bicameral hypothesis, and on that basis I would say that's not true. Do you
well, I guess James does spend some time looking at the books of the Old Testament. He reflects on the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament too. But he notes that some of the historically older Jewish prophets seem a little more bicameral in their relationship with God. And then by the time you get to prophet, I'm not even sure prophet's the right word, the wisdom writer Ecclesiastes, you're seeing this more reflective self-consciousness. And so in the what he took to be I'm not sure of the current dating of the various prophetic books, but when James was writing in the 60s and 70s, I think historians were taking Amos to be one of the historically oldest prophets. And if you look at a book like Amos, the prophet Amos, he's speaking in sort of this very typical bicameral way. He's just this kind of radio of receptivity to the divine voice, and what he's saying is really he's just quoting Yahweh. Yahweh says here, and he's just passing on Yahweh's voice. And by the time you get to Ecclesiastes, you've got this very reflective self-consciousness, and that's that picture, that development. I think you could fit into a orthodox theological view, right? It could be that the way we receive the divine voice changes through the centuries, that we grow and we start to internalize the voice as we become more mature, or as we become more distant from it. I don't know. There are different stories you could tell, but I don't see that outright inconsistency. I mean, my own, to show some of my cards, I do think that, after decades of thinking about religion and experiencing it, I do think my general story of religion on earth is, there's been contact between humanity and something pretty far outside of our ordinary notions of what it is to be human. Something so different, you may as well call it transcendent. And you may as well start to think about it as connected to the source of all reality and everything you know and everything that you're aimed at. But I tend to also think, maybe excessively liberally, that almost all of these explanations we'll talk about today are partly true, at least as partial explanations. I mean, like the Marxist interpretation of religion, that religion, big R, institutional religion, has this social political function to keep in place class divisions. And it's just so obviously correct in some spheres of explanation, just so obviously part of what's going on in the human religious story. And James he's onto something. Like, we don't want to dismiss him too quickly. He's clearly identified this phenomenon that cries out for explanation, this change in voice in human communication. Again, whether we date it to 3,000 years ago or 3,500 years ago, or whether the 3,000 dating works really good for Mesopotamia and surrounding environs, and not so good for the subcontinent or for the Americas, I don't know, but something seems to have changed, and that change isn't necessarily only explainable in sort of atheistic terms.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's definitely what I was trying to get at. So you see it as sort of all of these things could be partially true and mutually consistent. So don't be so hasty, I guess, is your message in just saying, oh, well, this obviously can't be true, and it's an automatic contradiction. Maybe there are ways to think about incorporating them and stuff. That would be your sort of position there.
Yeah, that's right. You just gotta avoid the reductivist or totalizing tendency in each of these theories. So, if the Marxist theory is, I don't think it's saying this, but if it's saying this is the fundamental explanation of religion in human history, and this is all religion is, that won't be consistent with a theological picture, and that won't be consistent with many other naturalist explanations of religion. But if you dial back from that reductivism and from that generalization, and talk about it being a partial explanation of a good chunk of the phenomena we observe in human history, then you can start to make it consistent. Then you can start to think of a toolbox of explanations of religion, right? And you can think of the appropriate tool for each circumstance. So if we want to talk, and under just different angles to get on different phenomena, right? So clearly one very instructive way to talk about the medieval ritual of the Pope anointing and crowning the king is the Marxist way, right? To understand that here state religion is showing its approval using this kind of divine mediator of the current class order, of the current system of secular power. and yeah, it would be, you're missing something if you're observing that medieval anointing ritual of Charlemagne or whatever, and you're not seeing that there's a kind of Marxist angle on this that's appropriate. But as soon as you say that's all this is, then I think you're making a mistake and you're becoming a doctrinaire Marxist, and you're missing a lot else of what's going on.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's up to you. Would you want me? There is something specific that I'm thinking of, and I'm trying to generalize it. But for me, there's an issue. So if the bicameral hypothesis is true, there is the issue of, okay, the image of God, human beings as image bearers. I know this is kind of Christian centric, so if you don't want to answer, that's fine. But how would that sort of fit with the bicameral hypothesis? Are the people prior to that truly human? Like, do they have if you don't have the powers of self consciousness and reflection, are you really an image bearer of God? That would you want to speak to that, or is that too specific?
No, that's it's a good question, and I don't think it has to be specifically Christian, right? It's a good question about what it is to be religious and human. I guess though I wouldn't so strongly identify the religious with self-consciousness in particular. I think religion being the connection of the creature to the transcendent or the creator can manifest in many different ways. There are many ways of living and acting in harmony with that thing. And there can be degrees of self-awareness of that relationship in the creature. And they don't all have to be explicit. And I'm even willing to think of forms of religiosity that aren't even particularly self-aware. Self-awareness is a really interesting, powerful thing. And I would want God to have it. I'd want the ultimate creature to have it. And I'd like to think that as we move forward and up in knowledge, we gain that, among other things. I mean, if you're going to be omniscient, one very important thing you've got to know is your own self, and you've got to be reflectively aware of that thing. But I wouldn't make that definitional of religiosity. So that may be one difference in our approach. And but also, I mean, even if you want to make it sort of definitional of religion, I guess you could say that in the Judeo-Christian progress, I don't mean necessarily from Judaism to Christianity. I just mean assuming there's been some development of the relationship between humanity and the Creator. It could be that we get better at that relationship, you know, in that some of Yahweh's frustration with early attempts to connect after Eden are reflective of this, that we're still growing, we're immature, and part of what we need to have a mature relationship with Yahweh is maybe some self-reflectiveness. But I wouldn't say that creates some deep inconsistency with the Christian account, right?
All right. Yeah. I think that was good to get that in there, just to see how people can maybe think about corporate verbs. They're mutually consistent versus mutually exclusive. At this point, I do want. So you mentioned Feuerbach. This was another guy that I know people in my audience are well familiar with. I hear it all the time in the comment boards.
Oh yeah.
From our good friend Tara. This is her chosen explanation.
Oh yeah.
But yeah. So Ludwig Feuerbach had this naturalistic explanation known as anthropomorphic projection. So, you know, it's turn it to you. What the heck is this? What is this explanation? And yeah, can you give us sort of an explanation as to what it is first?
Yeah, you know, it's I mean, his original view maybe isn't terribly different from James's view. I mean, there's a lot of commonality there. His original view, which he published in a work called The Essence of Christianity. This would have been around, somewhere around 1850, you know, mid 1800s. His view there was that, yeah, self-awareness is a very difficult thing, and it's a recent achievement. It's something maybe humans have in a strong dose, and you don't find it with quite that explicitness or intensity elsewhere in the animal kingdom. And it may also, I mean, that may be a sign that it's also something kind of recent, that it's an achievement. And for Feuerbach, there are these stages on the way to full self-reflectivity. And religion is one of the major, I mean, his view is that religion arises as a major kind of lever that gets us to explicit self-awareness. And I think his view then was that once we actually attain direct self-awareness, which is what we have now, religion will kind of fall by the wayside, that it was a ladder to get us to self-awareness. And the projection part of his theory, which is so influential, is that when we talk about the gods, we're really talking about ourselves. And we now sense that. And that's part of what makes us uncomfortable with our religiosity, he would say. And it makes religiosity seem sort of an ill fit with modern consciousness. But way back, and I don't know if Feuerbach gives quite the explicit timeline that James does, but further back in history, when we talked about the gods, we were groping towards talking about ourselves. And it's so hard to talk about yourself and to think about yourself in a direct way. This is the achievement of self-awareness, that we do it initially in this kind of babyish way. We project our own nature onto the empty canvas of the cosmos, and we talk about that thing. So I guess Feuerbach's view would be that when the Greeks are telling stories about, what the Olympians are up to, they're really doing a kind of sociology. You know, they're talking about human relations and gaining some sociological insight into human relations. And when we praise God, we're actually gaining self-awareness of what we are. Feuerbach's key distinction, though, is that I mean, clearly when we talk about God, we infinitize human qualities. So God, it's like a funhouse mirror where we're looking at ourselves, but blown up to infinity. By the time you get to Thomistic theology, we're blowing this thing up literally, explicitly to the infinite. But it wasn't always like that. It was, I mean, early Yahweh isn't infinite, maybe. Early Yahweh is just really big and really powerful and really knowing. And by the time you get to Thomistic theology, it's an infinitized being. But the basic qualities we ascribe to the deity and that we worship in the deity are qualities that we recognize to distinguish ourselves and to be most praiseworthy in ourselves, like God's love, God's capacity to move beyond the boundaries of the self and to take in other things, and to his sphere of concern, God's knowledge, God's power or competence in dealing with the world, nature. Of course, God's got omnicompetence in dealing with the nature. God creates it and has complete mastery over its operations. We're pretty good. We're engineering at a planetary scale now. We've got God-like powers increasingly over the natural world through our knowledge. So we've got these God-like qualities, and in religion we're kind of worshiping them. So that's why Feuerbach, I mean, provocatively put his theory in as the view that religion is idolatry. If you take idolatry to be the worship of the self or the worship of what is in fact not divine, typically you're anthropomorphizing God and putting in an explicitly human or animal form, and then worshiping that, and that's the sin of idolatry, that you're making what's divine too creaturely and then worshiping that. According to Feuerbach, religion in its essence is idolatry, and we just don't recognize it. And it's interesting, right? There's different kinds of projection. Probably there's a kind of furious projection that goes on when Judaism and Islam, these sort of iconoclastic religions, go about smashing the idols of their neighboring tribes. They're reacting, we might say in modern psycho-speak, to a brewing recognition of their own religion's idolatry. And so they're smashing their neighbors' idols because they're uncomfortable with the revelation it offers them, the Jew or Muslim, about their own religiosity, that it's all idolatry.
Yeah, it's an interesting view. I definitely think it's a partial explanation. But just I guess to provide some sort of follow-up or potential challenges to these views, what would you make of? So it seems like it relies a lot on psychoanalysis of people who we don't know intimately, we don't know their situation, that sort of thing. And some people might kind of scoff at this and say, you're just trying to come up with a way to dismiss my beliefs or something like that, and by psychoanalyzing me. Like how might you respond if someone sort of, from a religious perspective, whatever that is, would push back in that way?
Yeah, I think I don't want to say where the onus is exactly, but the religious person can best push back against Feuerbach, I think, by pointing to specific psychological experiences that defy this picture of Feuerbach's painting, right? If religious experience, if our encounter with the divine is ultimately just an encounter with our relatively ordinary self, though deflected in this projective way, there shouldn't be examples of genuine prophecy, probably, right? There shouldn't be examples of, I mean, we should, again, the best way to push back against Feuerbach is to find phenomena that defy this reductivist, humanist account of religion. And you can see that we've always felt that pressure, right? I mean, part of the great news of religion is, look, there is something beyond. The miracles are supposed to be the calling card of that. Prophecy is a calling card of that. It's not just us. It's not just in our head. There's something outside of us speaking to us, which knows things that we couldn't know in our ordinary human capacity, and can get us to do things or do things through us that we could not otherwise do. So these will always be the best knockdown arguments against naturalist explanations of religion, right?
Interesting. Would you say, so I know that you kind of said you don't want to necessarily place the onus anywhere, but it kind of sounds like you're saying this is sort of the default, unless the religious proponent can prove, well, here's a supernaturalistic element that I can prove this part isn't just that. Do you think this is sort of like the default, or that naturalism in general would be the default?
No, I don't default to naturalism much anymore. No, I wouldn't say that. I would just say if you're in conversation with a Feuerbachian and you're a theist, probably the best way you can really counter them is starting to get them to think about really unusual experiences. I mean, I know in my own religious life, whatever naturalist tendencies I had in my more analytic 20s and early 30s, I think a lot. I have to say a lot of that dissipated because of extraordinary experiences, and they really do count. They count in the history of religion. They are. People like special effects. Maybe we can deride that. We can deride their proclivity to go watch stupid summer action movies with lots of noise. And
you've been following me to the theaters, or
what's that?
I said, all right, have you been following me to the theaters and watching what
No, I can get cynical about Hollywood like a lot of us, but
sure.
But of course it's people want to see signs and wonders, and you can't fault them for that, and that it really is excellent evidence of something beyond us. So I guess Feuerbach's problem or question to the believer would be, it's just a little suspicious that so much of what falls under religious experience can be explained pretty well. We can get pretty far in explaining it just thinking of some more ordinary human psychological tendencies. Like I mentioned that this is the early part of Feuerbach's theory, the pure projection theory, this movement towards explicit self-awareness, this story he tells. The later Feuerbach, I think a decade or two later, he starts thinking more about these wish fulfillment tendencies we have, and starts thinking about there's still a projection at the heart of his theory, but he sees this projection as being very motivated by wish fulfillment, that humans, as we attain a kind of self-awareness of our situation in the world, we face this very painful reality. We see that nature is this system which sometimes we're in harmony with, but just as often is opposed to our interests and crushes us in the end, and seems to swallow us up unthinkingly without a thought, in a crevice, if only the crevice of the grave in the end. And this fact is so painful to us because Feuerbach sees us as we're this infinitizing creature who takes on this kind of infinite ambition to achieve the infinite and experience the infinite. And all creatures want some version of happiness, but we want infinite happiness. And so we've got this, at some point in our psychological flowering, we're faced with this contradiction where on the one hand, we have infinite ambition for infinite happiness, something like heaven and immortality. And on the other hand, we're very aware that that's not what the world offers us. We're no longer living moment to moment. We're seeing the big picture, and we're seeing where it all ends for each individual in death. Right? We're like the adolescent who becomes depressed, realizing that everyone's going to die. And this painful contradiction demands a solution. We can't live with the contradiction, the pain of that contradiction for long. Religion is the solution to that. And so religion is a way that we tell ourselves a happy story about what's going on, and in which we tell ourselves that it turns out well, that your infinite ambitions for infinite happiness will be fulfilled. That yes, nature has power over you, but there's something you are identified with, in whose image you are made, that has power over nature. And so I guess the Feuerbachian would say, by just referring to some pretty common sense, commonly experienced psychological tendencies, we can tell a pretty good story of a lot of what goes on in religious belief and maybe even religious experience, right? And so I agree with you. I think Feuerbach's view is clearly true, at least as a partial explanation. clearly a lot of what's going on in the life of the believer is something like wish fulfillment and projection and idolatry in the way he understands it. And the question is whether that's a total explanation, and I don't think it is.
Right. Well, let me the last sort of follow up or kind of like probing challenge on this view that I wanted to ask you about is, okay, well let's flip it. Couldn't the same thing be said about anti-religious views or even non-religious views for that matter as well? Like, isn't this type of wish fulfillment or wishful thinking and that sort of thing, anthropomorphic projection, applicable to someone like Richard Dawkins and his views against religions and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, in a way, the ultimate anthropomorphic projection is to say there's nothing beyond the human out there. That's like, it's not. It's yeah. It's yeah. I hear you, and yeah. Once we get into the strategy of psychological explanations, like motivational explanations of people's beliefs, we're getting into sort of ad hominem territory. That doesn't mean there are legitimate ad hominem arguments and illegitimate, and of course, to understand religion, we've got to understand our motivations in it. But yeah, we can. I think you and I have had similar experience, maybe encountering some particularly rabid naturalists and atheists that clearly there's some personal motivation operating here, whether it's projection or wish fulfillment or something else. We can take case by case, but yeah. So again, probably the best way out of that for either side is to, I don't know, something more in the line of evidence and proof for the thing or disproof of the thing. That's why I don't think you'd ever want to do this naturalistic explanation topic in final isolation from all the other stuff we do in Phil religion, like the arguments for and against God's existence. These things have to weigh in at some point too. If I remember, in the Essence of Christianity, Feuerbach has an extended discussion of, actually maybe it's not extended, maybe it's a little bit brief and dismissive, of some of the traditional proofs for God's existence. And it's been a while since I looked at the text, but I remember being not so convinced on him there that you can't dismiss the ontological or cosmological argument or teleological argument in these terms. They might initially be motivating the arguer, but in the end, you've got the argument, you've got the premises and the inference on the page, and you've got to look at that, right? Similarly with religious experience, like really intense mystical level experiences, I'm not sure Feuerbach was so convincing about that. That is, if you accept something in the neighborhood of wish fulfillment theory, yeah, we do often experience wish fulfillment phenomena, right? And you see it in operation in ordinary belief formation all the time if you take a close look at human mental life. But when you get into these very vivid quasi-perceptual experiences, I don't know, does the Feuerbachian have to say wish fulfillment is so powerful that it causes us to hallucinate? I guess they'd have to say something like that. I'm just not sure I'm comfortable reducing to wish fulfillment hallucinations the profound experiences of the Vedantists and the medieval monastics and so on. There's something a lot more profound to me going on there. And yeah,
I agree. I do. I like what you said in terms of that answer. At the end of the day, look, there are objective arguments and evidences, whether they're convincing or not. So that's what one needs to base it on. I kind of brought up that objection. I'm not going to name any names, but one of our professors that taught me, and he's a great professor as well. I like him. No names, because I don't want Tara to email anyone or bug people. But he kind of brought up this against Plato. He was talking about how Plato's notion of the forms. This is all just wishful thinking, speculative thinking, and he was talking about someone who advanced, who was a skeptic of Plato, and he's like, he made like sort of psychoanalytical attacks, and he's like, "Whoa, brilliant! Like this is so persuasive." And I was thinking, I'm like, well, this is just, it's the same as Plato. I could just accuse him of psychoanalysis. There's no proof that what he's saying about Plato is true or his motivations.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's always the person with the unusual view who's got to hold the onus, and they're the one who's going to be subject in social reality to these psychologically reductive views. Oh, you think something unusual? Well, why do you think that? And of course, it could be because it's true, and I've seen the reasons clearly for why it's true, and you can't. But yeah, we can't help it, right? When there's something unusual, it strikes us as anomalous, and we seek a special explanation for it. And we're just not self-reflective enough usually to think, well, maybe I've got the special. Maybe my whole society, actually, our default view is special in the sense that it's a deviation from the true.
Gotcha. Yep. 100% agree. Well said. All right. Perfect. So I want to move on at this point. So I'm just going to keep very generalized. It's going to be up to you as to what you want to mention. But can you maybe describe, okay, so outside of these two specific explanations you wanted to discuss, what are some other naturalistic explanations? I know you've hinted at some along the way, but yeah, like biological explanations. You mentioned Marxism there.
Yeah, I think yeah, we talked a bit about the Marxist view. I guess we haven't talked much about what seems to be an increasingly powerful way of explaining so many things, which is the Darwinian mode. So in the Darwinian mode, we think of humans as an animal, as an evolved animal. And then, with our sort of alien spectacles on, we observe this very interesting animal on Earth. And we notice that, I don't know, sometime over the last several thousands or tens of thousands of years, this phenomenon we'll vaguely call religion has emerged, the special form of behavior, with its associated very visible, very not vague behaviors like building mosques and bathing in rivers. And these behaviors call out for an explanation. And from the Darwinian angle, when an animal expends a lot of energy on a behavior, we've got to ask, what is it for? With this guiding presumption that very wasteful, like energetically wasteful behaviors would be weeded out in evolutionary history. And so if the human animal is expending a lot of its cultural energy, I mean, think of the amount of cultural energy used to build a pyramid or a cathedral, or to take Hajj in the year 1320, to take Hajj if you're living in Egypt. This is a lot of energy we're expending to fulfill a religious goal. And the biologist quite appropriately asks, well, what is the possible function here? That is, how does this religious behavior assist the animal in, this is crass, but in the end it's got to be reproduction, some form of reproduction of the individual or the species form. Not, again, it won't be crude in that all religious behavior is ultimately just one step removed from, trying to get laid or something like that. But reproduction, the reproduction of the culture and the life in it is somehow served by religious behavior. So that would be the guiding problem for the biological orientation to religion, right? That we expend a lot of energy, and the question is why? What purpose does this expenditure serve? And then you get different answers. I think what seems to be a fairly common answer is that religion generally helps us cohere socially. And we are a hyper-social animal, and our individual survival depends on a high degree of social cohesion, initially with our mother, and then branching out to the tribe, and so on. And I guess the trick is we have some natural propensities, including self-reflectiveness, and a high degree of autonomy and desire for autonomy, which might conflict with that. We have this ability to lie. We can lie to those we're supposed to be connecting with and create these disruptions in the social fabric for individual advancement. And so the great social problem in general is working out this relationship between individual and social ambition, I guess. And religion would be part of that solution. Religion would be a way that nature gets us to play well with each other, and it suppresses or mitigates some tendencies or powers we have to really operate outside the social fabric. So, take the idea of God as a kind of universal policeman. Right? If you could get people to believe that such a being exists, and that the being is advocating rules, demanding we follow rules that in the end turn out to be good for social cohesion, like don't steal and don't lie and honor your parents. Now, if you could just get people to believe such a being exists, then those people would be less likely to commit violations of those rules, even when they can get away with it. Like, so for their individual benefit, they can get away with it. But maybe it's bad for the tribe that they get away with it, stealing or lying or whatever. And so religion is this great trick that no one invented it, but it emerged through cultural evolution over maybe many hundreds or dozens of generations, which solves this problem in this particularly self-conscious species. So that's one way of thinking about it. A more interesting counternote to that comes out in Daniel Dennett's work. He published a work on naturalistic explanations around the turn of the millennium, I think it was, maybe around 2005. And what was the title of that book? Do you remember the title of that one, Dale? We used it in our course, but
Breaking the Spell.
Breaking the Spell. That's right. Yeah. He doesn't really have a thesis in that book, but he makes quite heavy use of these evolutionary and cog sci explanations of religion. But one view he asks the reader to hold in mind as we go down the Darwinian path is that this idea that religion, if it's a Darwinian phenomenon, must be for the good of our species is questionable, because of course another Darwinian phenomena is a virus, right? Or something which co-opts the reproductive machinery of its host for its own benefit. It uses its host to get itself spread. So according to Dennett, a chunk of religion might be virus-like. It might be something that actually isn't helping humanity. It's more like a bad cold that humanity's had for many millennia now, which inhibits our growth and health. But it's good for religion. And if religion gets itself spread by taking advantage of our social nature, our communicative nature. It takes advantage of some of our fears and desires and gets itself spread in that way. And so it's like this meme. It's this very, I think Dennett would call it the most successful memeplex of cultural history. Religion ends up being the winners of this competition between viruses, which take us over and in whose service we then operate. Right? When we go buy a box of Kleenex, it's for the cold in a way. I mean, it's us. It's something we're doing because we have the cold, and it's combating the cold or dealing with its symptoms. But it would be better not to have to buy the box of Kleenex to begin with, right? And so that's another interest. Like in the Darwinian spectrum, you could think of religion as something that ultimately is helping humanity. So a lot of these Darwinian explainers, they're not necessarily as critical of religion as you might think. They often end up with a kind of healthy respect for religion, in the same way that the zoologist might have a respect for the tiger's claws or the zebra's stripes or some other wonderful mechanism they've observed in the animal that helps it survive and reproduce. But there's also this other Dennett angle of thinking of religion as something virus-like, something biological, but alien to humanity's own interests.
Yeah. I was kind of wondering, even from a strict exclusivist Christian sense, or if you're an exclusivist for any religion, even taking someone like Daniel Dennett thing, there could be some partial truth to this. So it could be that God designed us with these religious impulses, and it's actually good for us to have these. But maybe something's out of whack. We're not in that ideal state, and therefore it can take on a more negative virus-like role in some respects. But
Yeah.
the underlying thing, it was good. It served a purpose, and it's been distorted in some way.
Right, absolutely. I mean, if we're thinking of religion as a meme-plex, in the original Dawkins sense of just a product of cultural evolution, or a unit of cultural evolution, information as a unit of cultural evolution, which is what a meme is. Memes can be false and memes can be true, and memes can be devoid of truth function too, right? Like the meme that 2 + 3 = 5. I mean, you can print that and put it on a t-shirt. It's a meme. It's an idea that is communicated socially. It's a true meme. We've got this in the internet age. We think of memes as being particularly virulent, often false info. But in the biological definition, a meme is just something which is spreading through cultural exchange. And we're motivated by all kinds of things. One thing we're clearly motivated by is the desire to know what's true. And not just for pragmatic purposes. I think often our desire for truth is interestingly disconnected from that, and that's where philosophy per se begins, right? I mean, the love of truth or wisdom itself, so one, if we're a philosophical species, some of us more than others, but if we're a philosophical species, then one factor which is going to be driving mimetic exchange in human history is our desire for truth. So one thing it will be good for a meme to possess, among other things, is truth. It's something which could get a meme spread. Of course, thinking just pragmatically, the truth is very useful. It's very useful to have a correct map of your environment. And our beliefs sort of coalesce into a map of our environment, social and natural environment. And it's very good. An individual who has a correct map of their environment is going to reproduce better than one who has a faulty map, often. So even if like we've seen today in so many cases, you can go pretty far down the naturalist path, even into this idea of religion as, it's not a virus, a meme-plex, and still ask at the end of it, yeah, but is it true? Clearly there's projection going on in religion. Clearly there's reproduction of class division in religious practice. Clearly religion functions as this kind of successful meme. You can think of very fruitfully of Christianity as being the most successful meme-plex in human history, at least in the history of the book. But at the end of it all, we can still ask, and to what extent is it true? And does God still exist? Right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Perfect. Yeah, so all right. I'm really pleased with how this is going. I think we're getting a lot of great ideas out there. The next question. So we've already been answering this throughout the whole time. So I'm gonna switch it up then. So I get that you and I as well believe that there can be multiple explanations, and they're not all necessarily mutually exclusive. There can be partial truth to them. Let me ask you this: do you think that there are any explanations that are outright false, that don't play a role in explaining religion in some way, or yeah?
None that I've encountered that I can think of off the bat. No, all the ones that kind of hover around in my mental space over the years have some kind of plausibility. I mean, it's really just the ridiculously reductivist, simplistic, generalizing naturalist explanations that are clearly false to me, right? That I react against, and they're quite common out there. Like these caricatures of religious explanation are out there. They're quite common. There are a lot of atheists who are pretty sure that religion is just all wish fulfillment, that it's just all people scared of death or something and running away from the cold fact of death that they, the naturalist, have dealt with by the age of 23. And that stuff is just clearly, it's dumb in that it's just not sensitive to the data that's out there. A nice thing about Feuerbach, I should mention, is, I mean, I think if you read a chapter or two from The Essence of Christianity or his lectures on religion, you'll see this is a guy who knows these religions a bit from the inside more than I get the sense Dawkins does. I mean, Dawkins can quote some of his favorite chapter and verse to show what a monster Yahweh is, and but I get the sense, I don't know Dawkins, but I get the sense he's got kind of a typical English public school boys understanding of religion, beginning with some kind of state Anglicanism and an understandable maybe distaste for that, and then that expands out into his picture of religion more generally. You read Feuerbach, and you're dealing with someone who's got a pretty sensitive grasp on the data and is doing his best to account for the depth of religious experience, right? And I think there's something similar going on in Julian Jaynes, where, I mean, in the end, I think Julian Jaynes is some kind of atheist, and he doesn't think the voices were from anything transcendent, but he's got this kind of healthy respect for the weirdness and the depth of religious experience. He, in a way, his whole life's work is motivated by an encounter with the profundity of this experience. He's recognizing more than the typical English scholar or literature scholar of the Iliad that there's a really different psychology operating in this ancient mentality. You know, he's respecting that something alien is operating here. Now, that alienness for him is not God. It's something on the realm of human pathological psychology. But again, in the better naturalistic explainers, you find they are respecting the depth and the variety of the data and trying to account for it. But you do find out there in a lot of trickle down, popular naturalist explanation, just these ridiculously reductivist views, which are coming from people who clearly, it's like they haven't actually had any kind of religious experience, and they're talking about something they don't know.
Yeah, very simplistic, the totalizing tendency.
Yes. Oh yeah.
All right. Well, before, I know you were really excited about the last question. Is there anything that you think is important about the explanations of religion that I didn't ask about, or that you would like to talk about for the audience?
Oh boy, there's something interesting going on in Feuerbach, worth dwelling on. At the heart of Feuerbach's explanation is this kind of equation, and it's supposed to be a shocking revelation that God is man, right? God is man. But if it's an equation, it goes both ways, right? So, and this is going to take us outside of Orthodox Christian,
that's fine,
theory, but into something a little more maybe Vedantic or monistic. But if what you're seeing at the heart of religious experience is some kind of equation of man with God, you have to then be open to the possibility that what you're actually witnessing there is the divinity of the human, and not the anthropomorphizing of the divine, right? When you say man equals God, the question then is, are you saying that we are really gods? Or are you saying God is just a man? The equal sign itself doesn't have the word just in it, right? So the equal sign it's bi-directional. And so there's that, when you go down that route, when you're sensing some kind of equation of God to man, you got to take pause and ask, what am I seeing here? Is it that this idea of God is just the all too human, or is it that there's something divine in us? And actually, we can bring it to more familiarly Christian terms. If you just think about, you don't have to think about humans literally being God, but you can think about humans being made in the descendant of the divine, and we have the divine in us, and that's our our essence is that relationship, and our ultimate destiny is to be in a very intimate relationship with that. Just because you're sensing something human in our talk about the divine, doesn't mean that you're well on your way to showing that religion, after all, just is humanist projection, right? So that's, and I'm not sure how sensitive Feuerbach was to this, but
the implications there.
Yeah, when I read Feuerbach, back in grad school, and I had a bit of the Vedantic influence operating quite strongly in my worldview at that time. That question became quite apparent to me, that it's hovering there over that text.
Excellent. All right. So, yeah, I'm going to turn it to the last question. Again, I know you're really excited about this one. So, I always remember I had I don't know. Do you know who Anthony Magnabosco is?
No.
Okay, he's an atheist, but he's known as a kind type atheist, and he engages in what's called street epistemology.
Oh.
It's invented by Peter Boghossian and that, but he goes out and he actually talks on the street with people, and he asks, he films this on his YouTube channel, and he just says, what's something you believe, and whatever it is, do you believe in ghosts or an afterlife or God or whatever you believe, and just let's have a talk about why you believe what you believe. And we actually had him on our show, interviewing him, and we did sort of like a mock thing. So he asked me, he went through his procedure with me, and he also went through it with my atheist co-host David Johnson. And his belief, David Johnson's belief, that they went back and forth on, was religion is bad for humanity. The world would be better if we just eliminated religion altogether. So I wanted to turn it to you and sort of, regardless, whatever the explanation or explanations, plural, of religion are, what do you make of this religious phenomenon? Has, in your opinion, do you think it's been an overall positive thing that's good for humans, or an overall negative thing? Yeah.
I guess I do like the question, in the sense that you can't help but wonder about it, and you can't help but propose an answer, if only speculatively. But on the other hand, it just seems so impossible to answer. It's like I find it harder. I find it more presumptuous almost to try to answer that question than the question of whether there's a God. The question of whether there's a God seems almost simpler than this really complicated counterfactual question about on the ground social psychological history, But having said that, of course, it is fun to talk about that. That's probably why I was looking forward to it. Can't help but wonder. And yeah, I tend to have this view these days. Things feel so apocalyptic to me that I tend to think about so many good things that enter our world and turn bad and fall short of their promise. And I think of religion that way too, as indicative of some kind of encounter between us and something often quite good, which then gets co-opted by other ends and powers. But I also think, if religion is defined broadly to be something like, the organization of our contact with the transcendent, or something like that, and we're not strictly monotheist, meaning, most monotheists actually admit of a large range of entities between the human and the highest, right? They're angels and archangels and demons and devils. And if your cosmology admits of that richness, then probably your picture of religious history will include contact with some of those other entities too, right? So the history of religion, clearly in the biblical account, we're being given a history of contact not just with Yahweh, but with angels and other entities, including demonic. So one way religion may have been bad is because it's been through demonic contact, that a lot of religions which end up taking power in our world are quite demonic. And so I hope I don't offend anyone out there, but when I look at the ancient institution of animal sacrifice, I mean, it can go back far enough and it included human sacrifice, but when that was mitigated or softened into mass animal sacrifice, I don't know, when I see that blood rolling at the temple, I feel we're close to something a little bit demonic. Like a god who's demanding that for a sign of your allegiance, or demanding that in some kind of economy of exchange for the gifts he will then bestow upon you. That has the mark of the demonic to me. So I think the religion of the capital T temple and the religion of the capital S state, and the religion that really is closely aligned with the major powers of our world, which have been making war and degrading our ecology for 10,000 years. I'm very skeptical of these traditions. So I think, like a lot of good things, including the idea of democracy and what have you, I mean, these things get degraded and twisted and used for ends that are evil. So clearly, a lot of what's gone on in the history of religion is bad. And some of that badness is just all too human badness. And some of that badness is humans, I think, influenced by something quite demonic, which wants to eat our world. I think there's something which can benefit energetically from eating life and degrading it into its entropic waste and feeding on that. And that's the demonic. And I think humans have been in allegiance with that thing. And a lot of big religion is in allegiance with that thing. So yeah, my answer is a little bit, I guess, obviously veering to the negative, that when I look at human history and when I look at the apocalyptic endgame we've arrived at, if only ecologically. I mean, there are other angles you can look at it, but we're destroying our world. And you've got to ask, well, what has been driving that? And I just see a lot of religious ideology and practice being woven into that destructive process. So, yeah. How about you? What's your overall view?
Yeah, so I think obviously, as a Christian, religion has been overall and will be overall positive, because and it's not even necessarily just looking at this state that we're in today. There's also the end state. It's the whole kit and caboodle type thing, right? So in the end, God is going to redeem creation. Everything that's bad is going to be made right in one way or the other. Even if you believe, so yeah, even if you believe in hell, I don't believe in a torture chamber model of hell. I think the people in hell will be happy to exist in that state. It's more about separation from God. Hey, you've got the choice in this life, kind of thing. So even all things considered, I would definitely say religion is.
Oh, right now. Oh, okay. But I think I got you. I got your point. Yeah.
But I do think, yeah, I was going to say, I do think that you make an interesting point in terms of your view, that so maybe looking at religion in its pure form on an individual level, you think that's good overall, but it's once it gets corrupted at an institutional level, that's where you kind of lean in the negative direction.
I'm not sure if I draw the distinction quite that way. I think at the individual level it gets twisted too. Definitely would make the distinction generally between the non-twisted and the twisted revelation, but I think very often at the individual level it gets all these. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, you cut out. Sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see it get twisted at the individual level, often by the people who are closest to the revelatory stream. People who are receiving that in a really high radioactive dose, it quickly turns toxic, and they become egomaniacs. You can see how that would happen. These gurus who are convinced that they are the highest incarnation of God on earth. Some of them are just liars. I mean, they're just pure charlatans who just know that they can play that role and reap social benefit from it. But some of them are just interpreting incorrectly this powerful experience, mystical experience they've had in 1963 or 1982 or 1822, and it's so powerful that a tempting interpretation of it is, I am God, and creation should be worshiping me. And so I think, this thing can get twisted very quickly at the individual level too. And a lot of the later social twisting maybe comes from the powerful narcissism that is built into the initial prophetic reception of it, in some cases.
That's interesting. I'm thinking of my view as well. Like, so just looking at this current state, forget about the final state. Has it overall, the vast majority of religious belief from a Christian perspective is, well, these are false. So has that been a net positive or net negative to have false beliefs and that sort of thing, and beliefs lead to actions. So yeah, that's something I would need to think about. Obviously, some Christians, my pastor, for example, you probably heard, oh, Christianity is not a religion. So you could kind of say religions are all bad, but Christianity isn't a religion. That's just plain semantics in my view.
Yeah.
Here I am asking you a question, and I don't have a good answer on my own end.
So is the question whether a way to explain these twisted receptions is just to think of them as false revelations or false religions?
Yeah, I tend to think so obviously anyone in any religion, there are truths in any religion, but at the end of the day they are false. Only Christianity is the true divine revelation that is going to get you where you're going. So that's sort of summarized in Jesus' statement, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I don't think you can follow like another religious path and achieve the same end or something like that. So that's in that way I would see other religions as sort of being negative, even though there are some good things in it. So yeah, I guess if we're looking at religions, yeah, that would be my answer, is to stand back and look at it from the perspective of everything, all things considered. As a Christian, everything will be redeemed. Everything that's gone wonky will be back where it is, and even the worst parts, the people that do not choose a state of salvation, they will be where they want to be. It's not, I think people have sort of a misunderstanding of exactly what hell is. It's not going to be pleasant. I mean, it's not a place you should want to go. You're not designed to be in that place. You're designed to have a eternal relationship with God and other people in a sinless environment and that sort of thing. But I would sort of stand back and look at the total picture, and on that front, unequivocally, religion has overall been positive.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a bit more about Jesus?
Sure.
I'd love to. Yeah, he's
sure. So in terms of his
a favorite topic, but I to push back a bit against your Christology. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to do it by actually staying with the assumption that Jesus was the incarnation of the highest.
Okay.
Right. Like let's take that as one of our working assumptions.
Okay.
It doesn't follow that he would have completely correct and lucid beliefs, and that everything he said would be in some literal way correct. I don't think so. I think there's a way you can think about like the epistemology of Jesus, the epistemology of the incarnation, and the experience of that entity, which allows for some of the degradations or compromises of incarnation. So, I mean, incarnation literally means coming into a body. And we accept that means coming into limitations. That's part of the great sacrifice. I think prior to the idea that the great sacrifice is that he was hung on a cross for a few hours. I mean, I find this idea a little bit ludicrous in that anyone who's been on earth for 30 or 40 or 50 years suffers bodily and mentally. And I mean, this is going to sound a little bit crass, maybe to Christian ears, but by the standards of crucifixion, from what we can tell, Jesus had a pretty easy crucifixion. I mean, often they would be hanging out there for days with wild dogs gnawing off their feet, and I mean, he went pretty well. So this is all just toward my point that, again, if we accept the notion that there was some great sacrifice in God incarnating into the world, I don't think we should fixate on the crucifixion as the site of that. I think as philosophers, we should think a little more fundamentally than that and think about the basic ontological situation of the divine entering into creation. That's the sacrifice. It's there from birth. It's the infinite taking on form, which then implies limitations. As soon as you take on form, you've got limitations. And we mitigate this, so we say yes, but Jesus is divine, and that's partly reflected in the powers of the miracles. The miracles show that though I am limited to this body and to the laws of nature, or seem to be, I can at any point overstep them or trump them with my divine power. But you might also think about the belief system of an incarnated God. Right. First of all, think developmentally. Would this being know from birth with perfect lucid self-awareness that it is God? Or would this be, a more interesting story, like a superhero origin story, is the idea that this self-awareness that I am the deity evolves, maybe with adolescence, maybe with encounters with, the book of Isaiah. He starts to realize, I fit the DNA of the Messiah pretty well. This is kind of uncanny. And he comes to this wonderful process of self-realization that he is that thing that is being worshipped. That's at least an interesting idea, and it implies limitations. It implies that at one point in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, he didn't know he was God, and he came to know it. And it climaxes in his encounter with John the Baptist. There he gets a kind of social, there's a social epistemology of mutual confirmation. Who am I? Who are you? Okay, are we thinking the same thing here? Okay, it's confirmed, right? He goes to the one who next to him would most know and most be able to tell. And he gets a confirmation that this thing I'm thinking is correct. And so this is just an interesting way of thinking about Jesus' self-knowledge of what we're presuming here, which is that he is God incarnate. When you allow in that developmental lacuna of knowledge, you can also then maybe let in, even in his sort of fulfilled state, when he's come to, developed into pretty full self-awareness of his divinity, there can be not incorrect statements necessarily, but very human, very touchingly human moments. And we see those in the Gospels. I mean, when he cries out, asking, in his final words, "Where are you?" If we accept incarnation, then he's asking, "Where am I? That the divine nature has fled from my immediate grasp in these dying breaths." And so you can maybe see other moments like that. So when back to your, if Jesus of Nazareth in fact said, "I am the way," and if we look at the Aramaic and whatever, get through all the layers of semantics and translation, and we can confirm in the depths of his psychology that he meant, "I am the only way to the highest," assuming all that, it may also be that he was over speaking and that he's still God. That again, it's hard for us to understand what it's like to be truly filled with divine nature. It might be that the human body and mind can only take so much of that, and it trips a little bit. It overstates the fact. When it tries to translate it into language or self-assertion, it comes out in hyperbole sometimes. So, in the Hindu view, God incarnates many times through history. And there are many avatars or incarnations of God. And it might still be that an individual incarnation feels that it is the only one. That's the power of that feeling. The power of that feeling is the feeling, maybe it just slides easily in the feeling that I am the only one. It's like when people, young people fall in love, and they fall in love for the first time. They've got this sense that it's new. What we're experiencing is unlike love that has ever been experienced hitherto in the history of mammalian mating. And it's objectively, it's a ridiculous view, but the power of that feeling of falling in love naturally generates this sort of egoic hyperbole. So what I'm saying is, even if you accept the view that Christ is divine, you might be able to, I'm not saying this is the way you're going to do it or be happy doing it, but you can let in something in the realm of error in the way he speaks. Just like you could allow, like if Jesus tripped a little bit once up his sandals and he tripped a little bit, does that mean he's not God? No, it means he's God incarnate. He's got a body which is partly now subject to all the vicissitudes and comedy of physical existence. That's part of the beauty of the divine sacrifice. And I'm just saying that sacrifice could have an epistemological dimension too. And then, then you can start to maybe reconcile some of those statements of Jesus, which are the go-to statements for the Christian exclusivist. You can start to interpret some of those statements in a more, inclusivist way.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess just to, first of all, thank you so much for being willing to kind of discuss Jesus specifically and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I always appreciate that. And these are doctrines that I've thought about. So just to sort of give you my take, if you don't mind, you're the guest.
No, no, absolutely. I'd love to hear what you think about all this.
Cool. So Paul, you are so much more with it in terms of the doctrine of the incarnation than most skeptics that I interact with. Most of them think, well, Jesus was Superman on earth. It was kind of like a theophany in the Old Testament because God takes on human flesh in the same way Hindu gods in the Old Testament. But that's not an incarnation. The incarnation is he actually takes on the human nature itself and all the essential properties of the human nature. So yeah, he's limited. He felt pain. He was genuinely tempted to sin and these sorts of things. Yeah. And he was so the divine nature was still there, but it was sublimated, and that can include epistemologically. I'm open that Jesus made an error. He said the smallest seed is the mustard seed. Well, assuming he meant that literally, which is debatable, but let's pretend he did, I'm cool with that. But Jesus could make an error on certain things. Important theological truths, like how to obtain salvation. And this would constitute what I call undue confusion. And I don't think God the Father could allow Jesus in his human nature to make those types of errors. So, yeah, like just to turn it, what do you think of that? Like maybe Jesus could make certain errors, but there are other errors that he would be prevented from making errors on because they're so important that he gets those.
Yeah, I like that idea. I guess a couple thoughts in response. One is that we don't want to sell humans too short on their capability to eventually, in the grand sweep of redemptive history, to understand the complexity of that incarnation, to understand something like the view I've been offering about how Jesus might even overspeak on these very Christologically central assertions, and misspeaking isn't quite the right word. In a way, it's funny, right? Like, strictly speaking, propositionally, he may have been speaking a falsehood, if indeed there are other ways, other incarnations say, and there are other ways to get to God, apart from a particular relationship with Jesus. Then strictly speaking, he's misspeaking when he says, "I am the only way." But in another way, he spoke perfectly appropriately, right? Which is that it's part of the evidence that you are a way to God, that you've got a special connection with it, that you're humming with that energy. And when you're humming with that energy, you'll tend to speak in this kind of extreme hyperbolic way. It's like the mark of the true guru is some of this true, and what his particular path is. There's like some of the early signs should some kind of drama around, like happening around this or around my relationship with it. It's a sign of energy. It's a sign of something important happening. So the way somebody speaks too, if they speak in a very like a naturally musical or poetic way, and these are all signs that there's something energetically interesting happening in that locus. And again, if they speak in what is strictly speaking false hyperbole, that too could be a mark of appropriate linguistic expression of what they experience in their connection to the divine. So it's I know I'm just recapitulating my theory here, but with the addition that we should let that humans are pretty sophisticated philosophical creatures, and it's not just you or me who will be able to understand this point. In fact, maybe philosophy explicates it very late, and there are people who understand it in a more intuitive, unexplicated way very early on in their encounter with these beings. But like I said, there were two things I had to respond to in that respect. I guess, what was the second one now? I yabbered on so long about the first one. In any case, no, I like that distinction, and that indeed, if you want to maintain a kind of Christocentric view, that seems like the best strategy logically to start with. Cool.
All right, and the second element you mentioned, so this is again an essential element of the gospel message, is the crucifixion and Jesus' atoning death, and the need for blood. You mentioned is an issue for you. Now, believe it or not, tonight at 7:00, I'm going to be debating this very issue with. Do you know David Smalley from Dogma Debates? Or
David Smalley from Dogma Smalley.
He's more pop. He's not an academic or anything, but he's got a pretty big podcast. He's an atheist and debates Christians.
Maybe not. That's not our David, eh? That's a different David, eh?
It's a different David, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I thought so. Yeah, no, I don't think I know that name. No.
Fair enough. Okay, but yeah, I'll definitely send you the link, because we're going to be debating this, because a lot of people have problems with it. So what I would just say is sort of like a pushback, and then you can get the last word on that. But so number one, believe it or not, I don't think Jesus did get off the hook. I think he experienced crucifixion like no other human being in history, because he didn't just experience, you've heard this, he didn't just experience physical death, he also experienced spiritual death, which is the punishment, the proper punishment for sin. So, when he's saying, God, why have you abandoned me? I think he was experiencing relational separation from God the Father, and that's the worst pain you can be through. And in terms of, well, how does it make sense then? Why is blood necessary? So blood is symbolic of life, and it's kind of like a necessary consequence of having this sin disease. When you sin and take on, sin becomes incorporated into your character. The only way to purge that is through paying the necessary consequence of that. It's just like having a disease, and then there's necessary symptoms which come about through that. So it's non-negotiable on God's part. The punishment has to be paid in order for the principle of the moral principle of justice to be upheld. But what I'm going to be discussing with David Smalley is, well, how does it make sense for somebody else to die in your place? Why? That violates justice. You're punishing an innocent person, and you're treating him as though he treated the sins for me. And the way I kind of reconcile this is I take a consequentialist view. So there are beneficial consequences that result from punishing people, and this is, I think I wrote to you about this, so you know this already, that come about. But one of those consequences is reforming the character of the sinner. This would be why we would punish them. Jesus paying the penalty, and because he can supernaturally form a mystical union with us and affect our characters and therefore redeem our characters. Therefore, that we can obtain the beneficial consequence even though without us undergoing that punishment. And I think that's what justifies penal substitution in that case. And it also explains, why is it necessary? Why can't God just forgive us? No, there's this element of there are necessary consequences of having sin that are non-negotiable. Jesus pays that for us. and then the beneficial consequences justifying that punishment can be attributed to us through this mystical union when he dwells in our hearts. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. I don't know if I would today take issue with that particular aspect of the relation of the Christian to Christ. It does seem pretty complicated to the outsider, and I like to think God operates in a simple way. Like I like your vision of hell because it's simple, and it does strike me as the way God would engineer it. God wouldn't need to add on extra punishments and send you to that place if you've been a sinner. The punishment is implicit in the form of sin itself. The sin and the punishment become almost united. That's efficient design, and that's what we'd expect from a super genius like God. Simplicity of the punishment is that your form of life is the punishment itself, your alienation from God, and you're choosing to be so alienated. That is hell. So I like to think God operates simply and maybe without, I don't even know the details enough of the blood sacrifice and redemption to debate it intelligibly with you, but it does strike me, like a lot of outsiders, as being pretty prolix, and you would say mediated and relational, and that's okay. That's fun. I guess about the idea, about Christ's suffering on the cross, that it included this extra suffering of. I recognize we're well outside our prescribed topic, but I'm having fun if you are. So
Same here, yeah.
Yeah. And I don't want to waste your vocal power too much if you got this debate tonight. So you can feel free to cut us off at any time if you got to get ready. But I would just say about that. It's an interesting point, and I do accept this that there could be something very special in the way Christ suffered on the cross, which is just, it's infinite, and it outweighs, if you want to do the utilitarian calculus, all the creaturely suffering of all crucifixions, past and present, and other punishments and sufferings. That's of course possible and fitting of the picture of who he is. But then you could also ask, well, I don't know, what is worse, to have been super rich and then lost all your money, oh poor you, or to have been poor from birth to the grave. So we're like that. We're poor. We're alienated from God through our lives, and hopefully at the end, afterwards, are reunited. Christ, in the picture you're painting, Christ has this divinity, this connection to the divinity on earth, and then loses it in his final moments on the cross. And that fleeing is going to be especially painful. But again, this is a really terrible analogy, or offensive analogy maybe, but of course the pain of quitting heroin cold turkey is especially painful. Apparently it's a exquisite discomfort, which most of us would have a hard time imagining. But of course, most of us would have a hard time imagining the pleasure of the first heroin shoot up too, if we haven't done it. And apparently that's pretty great too. That's, and so again, this if we're trying to say Christ suffered specially, I want to counter a little bit with the notion that, well, at least he enjoyed divinity for 33 years and then it fled. We don't get it at all. Typically, we get glimpses of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, well that's actually helpful to me. So thank you for helping me to prepare against David Smalley there. Because,
oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you raise an interesting point, a perspective of, well, there's this, it's a complicated scheme, and there's various ad hoc components. So if we have an overriding thing that, well, God must be simplistic or operates simplistically, Occam's razor, right? Then perhaps that's a reason that a skeptic could try to give to discount my defeater or my explanation of this skeptical argument. So yeah, that's a thoughtful thing to consider.
Yeah. When Jesus says, "I am the way," it's one of these mantra-like gnomic assertions. I mean, it seems so clear, and one way to interpret that is, you got to follow me, and I'm partly through this mechanism we're describing now of transference and mediation. I am the way to redemption. But I don't know, that just seems, there's a lot that's been loaded on there. My sense is there's a lot that's been loaded onto that statement, and it might be one of those statements which, if he uttered it, was misinterpreted the minute it came out of his mouth. In any case, there are just so many things it could mean. It could mean something like, I think a more Gnostic sense of what that would mean is, I am the way, meaning you've got to do like I did. You've got to go into the desert and break a little bit free. I mean, be a recognizable output of your tradition, just like he was a recognizable version of the Messiah prophecy being fulfilled. But you've also got to go into the desert away from all these structures of civilization, including its belief structures, and encounter something in its primal form. And then you come back from that encounter, come down from the mountain, come back from the desert, and you speak these assertions which are so weighted with that experience, they're just bound to be twisted and misinterpreted. So I am the way can mean so many things, and I just think we need to be, whatever we end up interpreting it as, we need to be a little bit humble in recognizing it could mean something very different from what we think it means. And then put the Marxist hat on a little bit, not just Marxist specifically, but be a little bit skeptical of the great secular powers of the world that have happily adopted this Christology. And you've got to wonder a little bit about, cui bono there, like, why is it to their benefit to adopt this very exclusivist view of salvation? So, I don't know what to think about it, but there's lots of reason to be skeptical about it, even if you're basically Christological in your orientation.
Sort of a moral influence theory of the atonement or redemption that you're sort of giving with the Gnostics there. But yeah, like I would just say, again, it's not fair to challenge you because you're not a historian or into biblical scholarship and that sort of thing. But I would just say that view can't, speaking as a historian or something, that view can't be true. We do know enough about the context of Jesus' words, and it is so. It's it's in the context of his mission, which includes dying on the cross, shedding his blood for our sins. And given there are numerous passages in the Old Testament, things like Leviticus 17 verses 11, I think it is, that stress, look, that the only way to be saved is through the shedding of blood, and that is a symbol of the necessary consequence of sin, which is losing your life. And in a biblical like
also sounds a lot like what a demon would say. Hey guys, blood, the spilling of blood equals life, and it's a sign of life, and it's a sign of redemption, when actually it's a mechanism of brutal cross-species domination and a mechanism of ecological destruction and the death of empathy and the death of the self and the death of connection to what's good. So it could be, if we want to be a little bit more radical about this epistemology of Jesus' self-knowledge, you can say maybe he was really, he's God, but he's really incarnated into the local culture, including some of its slightly demonic views about how redemption works. And it's part of the work of salvation is translating the words of the guru or the God. And but that's probably not even I don't even know if, well, actually that is a very I do identify a little bit more with the Gnostics, if I have to pick a school of Christianity, and they often will have this view that Yahweh is, at least in places, some kind of imposter god, and the rituals he's prescribed are not good, and the logic of redemption that he's been selling has been twisted. And it's at least interesting. It's interesting to think of Jesus himself being subject to this relationship. This, like, by the time he gets on earth, he's got a relationship with this twisting of the divine self that he is, refracted through this particular herding culture, right? Yeah. That's interesting. That's a very humanized Jesus. And I like that guy. I like that. I can let into my Christology a lot of errors, um, and that's part of the beauty of and part of the sacrifice of the incarnation. That it includes great sacrifice, including entering into confusion, like you said, sin. Well, how much confusion? Well, maybe confusion even to the point of starting to align with a slightly demonic twisting of the divine image.
Perfect. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. Thank you so much, Paul. It's been a great discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I also liked the bit at the end where I got to jump out of neutral host mode and kind of.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, please, no. As always, you're such a great mediator. Speaking of mediation, of course, you were back in the classroom where you were very early on a co-teacher of the course, and you're really wonderful person to talk to about these things. So anyway, good luck tonight, and yeah, we'll talk again sometime soon, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so thank you. Thanks again to Paul for this. I hope that the audience enjoyed and learned from this. It's always a pleasure having you on there, Paul. So yeah, I guess the audience already knows. After Paul's show, I'll be posting up the David Smalley show a few days afterwards. And yeah, look forward to that on the issue of the atonement, and have a great week, everyone.